All right. I think we'll at least get started with a bit of the introduction and let folks keep filtering in as we're waiting, but we want to make sure we get to this discussion. So thank you all for joining us for this panel that is on Women in the Electoral Arena a Century Later, Perspectives of Political Practitioners. So this conversation will bring us from the passage of the 19th Amendment to where we are today. My name is Kelly Dittmar, and I'm the Director of Research at the Center for American Women and Politics at Rutgers University and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Rutgers Camden. So I'm really pleased and honored to join and moderate this panel of experts, of political practitioners. You can see the full panel here. These are the women who have done the work, right? So these are the women who are doing the work to advance women's political power as either elected officials themselves, and or in work to support other women running and winning. So it's a real honor to share this Zoom room with them and with all of you. I'm going to start the conversation today with a brief lay of the land, drawing from our work at the center, what we call COP, and then move to a discussion with the panelists. And I would just encourage everybody who's in the audience to submit questions along the way, because this panel is much more a discussion format. So please feel free to submit questions as we're having the conversation. And I'll try to both integrate those and also leave time at the end to focus more specifically on audience questions. I'm going to shift over, and just because of the work we do at the Center for American Women in Politics, which is very data heavy, I am going to share a couple slides of some of the facts and numbers. So let me bring that up. All right, can you all see it? Thumbs up. So like with the story of women voters, the progress for women candidates and office holders after 1920 was not swift. It was certainly incomplete and exclusionary, right? In which women had and won power. For just some context, 50 years after Jeannette Rankin became the first woman elected to the US House, by 1976, just 19 women served in the U.S. House of in Congress overall. So 3.4% of all of Congress. And of course, it was only 14 years before that, in 1962, that the first woman of color, Patsy Mink, was elected to Congress. 6 years later, Shirley Chisholm becomes the first Black woman elected to Congress. It's not until 1989 that the first Latina is elected to Congress, and 2018 that we see the election of the first Native American women to Congress. And of course, that representation is even slimmer and newer when it comes to the US Senate. Only 5 women of color have ever served in the US Senate. Just by comparison, 69 white men serve in the US Senate today. So you can see that this path towards women political power, both in the electoral and legislative and elected office arena, has been slow and is relatively recent in some of the trailblazing that we're seeing from women. You all in the audience probably know a lot of these facts, but I do think it's important to put that timeline sort of parallel to women's voting power and women's voting influence over time. I'll also just share the traditional sort of over time, let's look at women's representation on the 100% axis to demonstrate that women are still underrepresented at every level of office. So that's this chart on the left. So less than a third of office holders across levels of office. And you can see here on the right, this is women of color as a percentage of women. So it's showing the increased diversity among women, but still underrepresentation, of course, of women by independent racial and ethnic groups. I also want to give some sense of what we're seeing in 2020. Again, you can get a lot more of this on our website, which is just cawp.rutgers.edu. But just to give you a comparison of what we saw in 2018, what we're seeing in 2020, and I'm sure our panelists can also speak to this as well. But this year, we're seeing that 2020 is another record year. So we spent a lot of time in the media talking about 2018 as a quote unquote year of the woman. It certainly wasn't a year of the woman for all women. We'll talk about that. But it was a year where we saw record levels of candidacy, nomination, and office holding. In 2020, another record year. We're seeing a record number of women filed to run for the House. There's a record number of women nominees for the House. Those record numbers are pretty consistent across parties when it comes to nominees, but when it comes to candidates, Democrats this year were level. Right, they saw their huge increase, as you can see on this chart, from 2016 to 2018. Republican women saw a much larger increase and accounted for really all of the gains in terms of women's candidacies at the House level this year on the Republican side. The Senate story is a little bit different. So first of all, we see less of a significant jump in women's candidacies and nominations, and that party story is more consistent. In other words, it's similar across Democrats and Republicans in terms of the slope that we're seeing this year. So yes, we saw a record number in terms of Senate candidates, but not in terms of nominations. I should say there is a special Senate election in Georgia, and so that could change the numbers. It could yield a record number for Republican women by 1. I also want to point to the record number of women of color, and more specifically, really trying to be specific to say not women of color overall, though it is a record there, but looking more specifically by racial and ethnic group, as I would suggest a lot of our research and work needs to do a better job of. And so here we're seeing, again, record levels of candidacy for the House, for Black women, for Latinas, for Asian and Pacific Islander women, for Native American women. And we at COB just started keeping track of Middle Eastern or North African women as a separate group this year. So we can't necessarily say if it's a record or not, but you can see that as well on the chart. We also have a record number of nominees among Black women, Latinas, and Native American women. Some, again, records broken, at least in terms of candidacy. We also have a record level of all women congressional contests. You can do the math to figure out that if you have more Republican women running, that means there is more likelihood that you'll actually have women running against each other, and that's true this year. We also think we'll see, we don't think we're at a record level of women state legislative nominees, which is sort of interesting because in 2018, we saw those records break at all levels, but it is really close this year. And so we're actually waiting on some too close to call races to see what happens. The trends by party are consistent. So more increase in the Republican Party and actually a decrease, we think, among Democratic women nominees. Again, we'll kind of see how this all shakes out when all those races get finally decided. You know, this year is a hard year to get decided, mail-in ballots and all of that. Record numbers don't denote parity. So this is just to show you, right, women are still not 50% of candidates, whether it be in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or overall. But what a notable statistic here is this 47.9% of nominees. So when we talk about gender parity in politics, part of it is how well represented are women as a proportion of the whole. So this year among House nominees, women are close to 50%. That's close to the goal we've all talked about in terms of representation. And of course, you can see that while Republican women are accounting for all the increase this year, they're still less represented within their own party than are Democratic women. And also, if you look among women overall, the majority of women candidates are still Democrats. The last piece that I want to point to is sort of the outlook. I am not a great political prognosticator, but we also just have to be careful to note that while there are record levels of women running, this pool starts to dwindle down when we look at competitive races. And so this is just based on Cook reports. You could argue that they're not as good as other rating systems, but just by one measure, you can see the women who are in these non-incumbent women who are in these races that are particularly competitive or even likely to win. So Republican women, Democratic women, a couple of signs here. We will see more Republican women get elected this year. Right? We had one new Republican woman elected to the House in 2018. I'm very confident we'll see more than that this year. But they're also trying to get back at the level of representation they were before 2018. So a lot of the gain might be just making up lost ground. For Democratic women, a lot of them are incumbents because they won the last time in competitive races. They're going to have to hold those seats. So what's not as clear on here, although you see it in the competitive races in the right, the incumbent women, that are going to be defending their seats. And many of those are Democrats, and some of those are being challenged by Republican women. So those are some trends to watch for in the House. In the Senate, of course, we could lose representation because some of the most vulnerable candidates are women candidates, particularly Republican women in the Senate. So we're kind of paying attention to that as well. We can make history in a lot of other ways this year for women. We could elect the first Afro-Latina woman to Congress. New Mexico is going to elect an all-woman House delegation. They may also be all women of color for the first time. We'll elect the first woman senator from Wyoming, first woman of color statewide in Pennsylvania, first women of color to Congress from Washington and Missouri, and possibly the first Latina to Congress from Indiana. So there are points of progress as well that we'll be celebrating this year, no matter what happens. So that was my sort of hopefully quick setup. But I do want to sort of say that hopefully sets the ground and to discuss the experiences and perspective of the women we have with us today. So we're lucky to be joined by Mayor Yvonne Spicer, the first mayor of the city of Framingham, Massachusetts, where she served since 2018. A longtime educator, Mayor Spicer was previously the Vice President for Advocacy and Educational Partnerships at Boston's Museum of Science. And prior to that, she was an administrator in both the Framingham and Newton public schools after beginning her career as a teacher in Framingham. In addition to her role as mayor, Mayor Spicer has previously served on many appointed boards and committees, bringing her educational expertise repeatedly to her public service. So thank you for being here, Mayor Spicer. Eva Pusateri is the president and founder of Expert Communications and Training, where she brings more than 3 decades of experience as strategic and communications consultant and a nationally respected trainer and consultant. In particular to this conversation, she has extensive experience working to help elect candidates and more specifically, help women candidates to be successful. We've been particularly lucky at COP that Eva has been a premier trainer at our Ready to Run campaign training program for women. And she's also president of the Lincoln Series, a leadership and campaign training program for Republican women in Illinois. Thank you for being here. And finally, Nina Liang is the executive director of Emerge Massachusetts and an at-large city councilor in Quincy, Massachusetts. She's the first Chinese American city councilor elected to Quincy, her hometown, and has served in that role since 2015. In addition to these jobs, because she's not busy enough, Councilor Liang has served on multiple boards to support her community and is co-founder of the Quincy Women's Network. So thank you all again for all you already have done and do to advance women's political power, and thanks for being part of this conversation. I just want to encourage again those in the audience to ask questions along the way using the Q&A at the bottom as we continue the conversation. So I wanted to start with a question to everyone, which is really about trying to think about how we would engage women thinking about running for office. So if a woman came to you today with an interest in running for elective office, what would you want her to know about being a woman candidate in the current political environment? And perhaps a follow-up to that, are there particular experiences, opportunities, or challenges that she should be aware of or that you believe are distinct to women? And so maybe I'll start with Mayor Spicer.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Really appreciate it, and it's great to be here. You know, one of the things that is so important as women, we have to remember is that, you know, as you laid out the data, you know, being in politics has certainly been a journey for us, and will continue to be a journey. And the higher you go in your seats, whether local elections to state to federal elections, it's going to be a journey. So accept that, know that, and in the meantime, surround yourself with people that lift you up, that are going to inspire you, and be real clear about why you want to run for office. You know, what is it that you want to bring to the table? And as you go through this process, you know, and I say this often, especially when I'm speaking in these kind of forums, it's one of the most difficult things about running for an office is the mechanics, raising funds, building a team to get out and support you. And one of the things that I say is critically important, you know, for women as collectively to support one another. You know, if a woman puts out an ask to you to donate to her campaign, whatever you can give it, because that also builds her confidence that, you know what, people will support me in this effort, and to be able to keep moving forward. So those are the kinds of places that I would start first and foremost. And then I also say too, be grounded in who you are, because you have to know who you are in mind, body, and spirit, because it's hard. It is hard work running for an office. It will suck the life out of you, your family, your children. We're good at multitasking, but it is a long journey to keep moving forward. And I think also having that support network within your family is going to be critically important to run for an office. And, rally your troops to, if you have children, have your children, your husband, spouse, and your extended family. You want to make sure everybody's on board with supporting you in this initiative. And I just said, keep moving forward. And here's the other thing. You may run and fall short of your goal. Keep trying. Don't give up. Get back in there, learn what you can, say, what could I have done differently, and keep moving.
We need a little positivity in messaging this week. Thank you. Ava, you've been doing this for a long time and seeing the landscape, right, that women are traversing in campaigns. So I'm curious your thoughts on this.
First, again, I'd like to thank you for pulling this panel together, and also for our host university and pulling the day together. As much as we are improving, as your numbers show from your report, Kelly, and we still do have a long way to go. So this is an important journey. So, there are challenges, but there's also a lot of benefits and opportunities for women as they step up to run for office. And some of the challenges I'd like to kind of put out there so they understand the realistic journey that the mayor was just referring to is that there is still a bias, and it's both a conscious and an unconscious bias referred to as the gender gap going on out there. And we need to acknowledge that, because it's not an easy road. It's a lot easier than it used to be. There are a lot more groups and organizations that support women, but women also have to understand that that is not a guarantee, and they might not get the support they want and or deserve, both from their parties, but also from other organizations as well as voters. So as part of that bias, it's two-tiered. There's the voting bias, that some people still aren't comfortable voting for women. But then we also have to understand with women, there is the ambition bias, in the sense that in general, a lot of times when men step up to run, they'll say, you know what, I think I can do a really good job in Congress. I'm going to run. Women, it's more, you know what, we need to fix this issue. What office do I need to be in to fix this issue? And then they'll run for that office. So there's two different motivations there, where I just want to serve versus I want to fix this issue. So if not everybody's seeing a problem they think they can fix, women aren't as quick to step up. So almost, which came first, the chicken and the egg, is to getting more women to run for office. So do kind of need to keep that bias in, and maybe start getting some of that other ambition. Just say, you know what, I can make a lot of difference on a lot of results, and just run for office in that regards. But I'd like to reinforce, also the opportunities that exist because of that. Because you can make a difference on that issue, but there are so many other issues that maybe you haven't thought about in running for office that you can make a difference. And I'd like to see us get to the day where we stop saying the first woman who did this in office, or the first woman elected to this office, that that's no longer a headline, because women have held every level of office and the possible, and we can do that. And I think that that's part of the encouragement that people have to think about when they're running for office also is there's the direct impact they have on issues and legislation, but there's also the indirect on future women candidates and young women. Once they see them in these positions, it's more likely they'll step up and they'll run for office also.
Agreed. That symbolic importance, which is often hard for us to measure and research, but I think any of you who served in office feel it, right? Like you're in that interaction, especially with young people, boys and girls, sort of reframing what they see as an elected official, and what they expect and what they see as a possibility for themselves. I just want to, before I move on to you, Nina, about this piece about ambition too, and I'm going to interject because it's a peeve of mine, is that we think about that holistically. In other words, and I think this is what you were speaking to, Ava, and also Mayor Spicer, that there are challenges in the structures. Yes. There are biases in the structures. So women are often rational thinkers saying like, I don't want to, the cost benefit of this, right, is not, so my ambition in terms of running for office may be lower because I see that the system doesn't work for people like me, or hasn't worked for people like me, or has actively excluded people like me. And so how can I be as successful in the system, or can I do what I've been doing and women have been doing forever, which is leading outside activism and moving a policy that way. And so that difference, as well as something I know we've come into contact with at the center, which is trying to convince those women who've been effective advocates and activists to translate that into office holding, into candidacy and office holding. And I think optimistically we're seeing more of that, which I'd love to ask you about, Nina, too, because I'm sure in Emerge, this is part of the work you're doing to encourage women and recruit women to run. So both to the first question and to that more specifically.
Yeah, so I just also want to reiterate too, I want to thank Kelly for moderating this, but I also want to thank Sarah and Nate for running point on this. I'm really excited to be in the space with the mayor and with Eva and the work that you guys are doing. It takes a village for this work to get done, and we're not anywhere near being close to being done with it. So if somebody came to me today and said that they wanted to run for office, I'd say do it. I'd be thrilled that they are declaring that they're running, as opposed to wondering whether or not they should. And I'm sure all of you know, and many of our attendees have probably heard, that it takes 7 asks to get a woman to run for office. And so if a woman ever said, I'm going to run, I would be 100% behind their efforts to try to make sure that they had the tools ready to go. I think, some of what the mayor and what Eva was saying really resonated with me. One of the first things that I was thinking about when I first decided to run for office is very much that imposter syndrome, and I feel like even after you get into elected office, that imposter syndrome almost permeates the work as you're trying to navigate how to be an elected official, as well as legislating and doing constituent services. And so that really follows you even after the campaign is done, after you put the yard signs away. It's tough, right? I feel like women in nature, and this is a blanket statement, so I apologize ahead of time, that we are just doers. We like to keep our head down, like you were seeing, Eva. We, multitask. We like to just be effective, right, and get it done. And so to put ourselves out there and to put our name out there and to make the ask for fundraising, right? Invest in me. Why should you give me money? You're investing in me. It's a lot more turning inwards. And I feel like we're very much, folks who turn outwards to help and support others. And so it's a very weird dynamic to all of a sudden turn around and turn the spotlight on yourself. And I feel like that is a challenge that follows you throughout your election, as well as once you do get elected. The second thing is that the mayor was talking about a little bit earlier, is that it's still today in 2020 is incredibly challenging being a woman in this space. The patronizing comments, the sort of head nods and the tones, and those kinds of things. It happens a lot, and it's actually amazing. I'm now serving as a city council president here in Quincy. And, as head of my body, I still get that from a lot of folks. It's like I'm head of my body here, and the conversations that I have with folks, you still get that patronizing tone. And even worse than that, you get these side comments that people would never say about, your fellow male colleagues. And again, to the mayor's point, you have to have thick skin with this. You really do, because when you hear comments like, oh, is that how you're going to wear your hair? Or, I feel like your lipstick didn't really look that good on screen, or why is she wearing heels in a parade? Can you believe that? Like, these are actual comments that I have heard in my years of service. Just me, one woman alone in the entire Commonwealth, let alone the nation, who serves in elected office, so you can just imagine how much more I'm sure the mayor has heard in her time, and ever you've heard from people that you've trained and worked with. These comments still happen today. And it's very frustrating when you're up there trying to talk to a resident, trying to talk to a constituent about their raising tax dollars and how they can't afford to stay in their home, or about how they're going to put their kids to school. When somebody might come along and while you're trying to have that conversation, just comment about, I really like that blazer on you. That's a really nice blazer, and you really have to remember to ground yourself, and again, to the mayor's point earlier, have a good, strong team around you, people who are going to be able to refocus that and make sure that when those feelings are hijacked in that moment of stress, they can ground you and remind why you're doing this work. And so to your earlier question, Kelly, what I love about, heading Emerge Massachusetts is that's what this network is. We've trained over 400 women now. The mayor is one of our amazing alum as well. And we really, for 6 months, give women the toolbox, right? How do you fundraise? How do you do messaging? How do you do fields? And we hope that they take those tools and that they're equipped to go out there to do this work. But even with fundraising, for example, you know, women don't particularly you know, live in those sort of higher thresholds of fundraising. And so that's something that also needs to change, right? It's not just about the women who are running, it's also about the women in the ether around politics. You know, who are those that are in the high level positions of fundraising, you know, so that you can make those phone calls and support your fellow women candidates. So we have a long way to go. There's certainly a lot of challenges, but I think having this, being able to call these things out and call them to light is really important, and then addressing them, past them.
Absolutely. I always say these institutions, right, we have to remember institutions are really stubborn. And so you can be women who are the first and we increase representation, but it doesn't mean that those underlying dynamics, right, go away. So that sexism, the racism, the biases that are built into these institutions, literally built in, you know, talk about bathrooms and legislatures, and are built without women in mind, are built on a basis of racial exclusion. Like, how do we actually change the fundamentals of those institutions? And this point about, you know, comments about appearance and things, one of the things we heard in our research when we were speaking to congresswomen, right, time and again, is literally not being recognized as a member, right? Like having the security guards question whether or not you are, you know, a city councilor, or are you a member of Congress, because you don't look like all of the other members that have served to date. And how do we sort of change, right, those deep-seated biases? Obviously, the experience of women candidates, like women themselves, are not monolithic. And so I want to continue to emphasize that in our conversation, because we talk in broad strokes about challenges for women and opportunities for women, but we know that those vary. One way that they vary is by party. And so I wanted to ask Ava a little bit more how, if at all, you think the terrain for Republican women candidates and how the terrain they need to navigate is different than Democratic women. I'm sorry. It's a tough subject.
Just kidding. Just kidding. There's a big difference. And, you know, just start with the numbers. You know, go, if you haven't read it, go read Kelly's report, The Unfinished Business, and it tells you, you know, the results are in the numbers. So blatantly, the Democrats do it better. You know, as a chair of the Republican National Committee, we have a woman, Ronnie McDaniel, and she's doing a great job. And she started women's efforts when she was chair of Michigan. So she's all into this program, getting more women involved. But it hasn't trickled down throughout the party. And the Democrats have just been much more proactive over the years. And I say, look at the numbers. In the past, the more Democrat women running. You know, this isn't something that just happened one day. This has been something they've been doing better than us over time. We're playing catch up right now. And you know, we're doing a little bit better, but we still do have a long way to go. It's both in recruitment, but it's also in fundraising. You know, there's people have to look at what other groups are out there. Sometimes it's not just about the candidates, it's not just about the party, but Democrats also have better women's groups that have been around for a longer time and have been a lot more active and a lot more in the forefront of recruiting women. Republicans do have groups, but not to the stature that the Democrats do have groups. And then the other thing that's in there I want to talk about is the whole point about identity politics. You know, Democrats are willing to vote for women because they're women. Unfortunately, Republicans aren't doing that as much. You know, they're not willing to vote for women just because they're women. They're voting for the person who they think is best for the job. And that translates to fundraising as well. Democrats will give money to women candidates because they're women candidates. Republicans aren't doing the same thing. So not only is it in the numbers, but it's also in the support that we are behind and trying to catch up. And it works, like I said, behind the scenes as well. I mean, you know, when I started in politics, I was often the only woman in the room. And I think Democrats have a lot more operatives than the women do, than the Republican women have operatives as well. So it's both on the ticket, behind the scenes, and the party, and the fundraising everywhere. We're unfortunately still playing catch up.
Yeah, and I think that piece about voter sort of demand. So one of the things we've seen in a lot of the polling is that gender, in fact, it isn't so much that like Democratic women vote for women, right? So gender affinity is not necessarily a particular vote choice, but to your point, they are more likely to say we should have more women in office, broadly speaking. So the valuation of greater demographic diversity overall as well, right? They're also more likely to say we should have more racial representation and diversity in office on among Democratic voters versus necessarily I'm going to vote for you because I'm a woman, which is one of those challenges in explaining to folks, right? Like,
as well as the fact, because of all of the efforts, they have more opportunity to vote for women because there are more women on the ballot, and therefore it becomes more of a normal thing.
Absolutely. So obviously also those challenging a monolithic experience for candidates also looks at variance by race and ethnicity. And I wanted to go back to Mayor Spicer. You know, you've been a trailblazer, not only in being the first woman or the first mayor of Framingham, the first woman, the first Black woman. And I assume this is not the first space in which you've been a trailblazer. And so I just wanted to speak to you as well. You know, how important has that been in your experience? And also how important do you think it is for researchers and practitioners to really understand the distinct experiences of women candidates and potential candidates and really look at this with a more intersectional lens?
Oh, what an excellent question. You know, and you're absolutely right. Being a woman that has a science and engineering background, you can already see that, you know, for the last 35 years of my professional career, my world is dominated by white males. And you know, in every space that I've been in, and I'm first one to graduate from my program at my university, you know, so the first go long and wide for me. And what does that tell me? You know, it tells me that I'm grateful for the experiences I had growing up with parents that never put limits on me on what I could do because you are female, because you're African American. And it also kind of extends back, and I was very happy to see it in your one of your slides in the research is, you know, I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And, you know, and I remember being 6 years old and in our first grade classroom, and we had a congresswoman come to our classroom. And that congresswoman was Shirley Chisholm. So she is my congresswoman. And who knew at 6 years old, I would be sitting in this seat years later. But that, you know, you think about, and I remember asking her, what does a congresswoman do? And she said, my job is to help people. That is, you know, that's the mission. And so I also come back to the way I've lived life is I come from a family of helpers and of doers. And so that was always put front and center. Now, with that being said, you know, you can't lose sight. I can never, this is one of the questions that you always see on forums, you know, women and people of color, you know, which one do I choose? You know, and so you go back to the intersectionality of all that I bring to this job. And even running for this office, I ran for this seat based on my leadership experience. And as much as those wanted to make race be the issue, my race and gender be the issue, more so the race than gender, it was important to realize that my community of Framingham is predominantly white. I am the mayor of a predominantly white city, and that is also a dynamic that is very different for a lot of my colleagues of color who are mayors in other cities. So, you know, and that also speaks volumes about my community and their belief in me. And I won with 59% of the vote. So, you know, against a white male person who was here for eternity, you know, so I look at those people voted for a candidate. And yes, women, you know, looking at the data, the women really came out in droves to vote for me. So, you know, you can't lose sight of that because I can never disconnect my identity as a woman and certainly as a person of color. When I walk in the room, when someone says I don't see color, I said, something's wrong with you. You have an issue here, because I do bring a different lens to look at this work. And whatever experience or tape you have going on for you that associates people that look like me, that's going to trigger something for you. And I try to look at it as an opportunity to enlighten, to inform, and engage. and give a perspective that you may not have thought of. So yes, as the mayor of this city, I have been asked many times when I'm meeting new people, which mayor do you work for? I said, I am the mayor. So that's the kind of thing. And once again, there's a tape that went off that said, no way could this woman with this bald head and these pearls be the mayor of this city, So, that's and it's an ongoing challenge. But I do remind people that don't put people of color in a box or as a monolithic person that says, I speak for every person of color in office. I don't, because their experiences are going to be very, very different, and really being mindful of that. So I think it's important to see it, but also understand that the experiences could be very, very different.
Thank you for that. And I think tied to those experiences, then when you're doing this sort of practitioner work, you have to be aware of that difference, right? I mean, that's what, some of the work we've done at COP and many of the researchers who are part of this conference, I think, have smartly done, is to say, if you ignore those differences, then the work to try to help and advance women's political power isn't going to work, right? Because it's built for a model that doesn't fit all of these women. And I just have to make the one point about this electability bias. So you noted your town being majority white. This has been one of the hurdles to women of color, in particular Black women, I think more specifically, in being recruited and supported as candidates in majority white electorates, whether it be a city or a district or a state, because those who are the recruiters are like, I don't know if they can win. Time and again, we're seeing that, of course, they can, right? Whether it be majority the last election cycle in 2018, the new women of color elected to Congress, more than ever elected in majority white districts, but really calling that out and putting a focus on the fact that there is fiction among belief, right? Among those who do the choosing and tap people based on the fact, which is the numbers show, you and Ilhan Omar, and these women, we can be successful in all sorts of districts. So Nina, your work speaks to both of this, both as a candidate, obviously, and your election as well as a trailblazer, but also in the work you're doing to train candidates. And so I just want to give you the space to respond here as well, in terms of how important it is that in your work and in your experience, there's some variance in our understanding and research and practice and how we support women who might want to run for office.
You'll have to repeat the last part of that. I have Comcast here and you just cut out a little bit. I apologize.
No problem. Just the importance in your view of us being thoughtful about these differences and diversity among women, being thoughtful about intersectionality and the intersections of identity that women bring with them as you're doing trainings, as you yourself are running and serving. Just your thoughts on what Ava and Mayor Spicer have been speaking to.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and it's something that I have been grappling with for a long time to try to understand, but also to then be able to share with folks and have an educated conversation with other folks to see what we can do to improve the numbers and to improve representation, and frankly to have more women and women of color in elected office, at all levels of government. And I think for me, the mayor said it really well, right? It's really tough because you run for office because you're passionate about helping others, you're passionate about doing the work, and it's very difficult to be put in that box where folks will look and say, well, you're a woman, so we should support you, and that's the only reason why. Or you're an Asian American in a city that has the highest percentage of a population, so of course we should elect you. Yes, a vote is great, a vote will help you to win, to do the work, but it is frustrating sometimes to only be looked at as that sort of number, right? That statistic. And so tokenism is a thing that is, I think, happening now more than ever, not just in elected office, but in the private industry as well, in the nonprofit industry. And that's something that, again, I want to be really intentional about when we're doing this work, whether it's to support other women who are looking to run for office, other women of color, but also in the training that we do. We want to make sure that we are really identifying the person themselves and what it is that brought them to that space, what they look like, and being a woman, yes, their experiences certainly, I think, will inform what their platform is going to be to run for office. But for me personally, and then the work I do at Emerge, what's really important is to make sure that they own that identity for themselves and they don't let somebody hijack that. I remember a conversation that I had when I ran for office. I think it was maybe the first or second time. And there was this challenge about somebody else being Asian American. And somebody looked at me and said, Nina, you never have to stand on stage and say, by the way, I'm Asian American. You know, they can look at you and they'll know that. So it's just it's a weird space to be in when people look at you and then use what you look at as your identifiers, and don't listen to your platforms or listen to what it is that you have to offer, what your passion is. You know, I have a background in businesses and entrepreneurships in the restaurant industry, you know, and I am really supportive of the small business industry here in the city, you know, and more often than not, folks will look into say, well, but you're the young minority. That's wonderful, you know? So again, I think what's really important is that we want to make sure that for women and for women of color to feel like they are able to operate and play in this space and run for office, that they're also not going to be tokenized as well. You know, that what they bring to the table really has value and they're not there just to check a box. And so I think for this effort and the work that we're all doing here in this space, it's to remember that when we reach out to these communities and we do reach out to these women and, you know, work with them to really help them, again, feel that confidence, you know, so too are we not going to patronize them and make them feel like they're tokenized. And so I think both of those efforts for all of us, you know, regardless of our background, we need to make sure that if we're in that space that we're being intentional about that.
I think that's so important. And I love that, Mayor Spicer, even when I sort of first, posed the question to you and you saying, hey, look, it's my science background, right? Like that's my unique background. So let's not just assume that it's unique because of my race and my gender. And I think that's important, right? For me to go, yeah, duh, like intersections of all sorts of identities and not just, to Nina's point, the ones we see or the ones that are touted most by those in media, because that's of greatest interest to them. But, you know, obviously that's gonna really affect how you do your job because of that background.
I had one other thought that just came to mind though, as we were talking about this. The flip side to that, and I'm gonna be brief here, the flip side to that though, is that, you know, I'm approaching it that way, right? I'm not gonna look at a woman and say, I'm just gonna vote for her because she's a woman. But men do that. You know, men will be like, oh, you know, he was on a rowing team. I was on a rowing team. I'll vote for him, you know? So that could also be, as much as I want to view it that way, to say, you know, I value more than just voting for somebody because she's a woman. I think that could also, when you're looking at men and women and how much they are out voting in numbers and who they're voting for because of just gender, we're disproportionately, I think, looking at women with a more critical eye than men are when they're voting for fellow men, if that makes sense. And that's something that I've also noticed. So just wanted to add that in there as well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think it's also giving a little space to the fact that, and Ava, you could speak to this too, because I do think this is a partisan sort of philosophical difference sometimes, which is that when we say identity politics, sort of what do we mean? And when we say we're voting for a woman because she's a woman, there's one level to think, well, I'm voting for you because you share my biological sex, right? Or I count your gender among the things that brings qualifications to office because I understand, right? And obviously, look, I work at the Center for American Women in Politics. So this is how I view the world, which is that your gender brings with you distinct experiences. And that if you have those experiences, I want that at the table. And I understand they're different and they vary, but I want somebody who knows what it's like, you know, who's more likely to be the primary caregiver, who's more likely to experience a gender wage gap, who's more likely, unfortunately, to experience sexual harassment and bias in the workplace. Like I want that voice at the table as well. Instead of it just being, I'm voting for a woman because we're alike. We're alike in substantive ways that affect policy, right? So I don't know if that speaks to, Ava, do you think that's a fair, am I being too simplistic about some differences in the perception?
No, absolutely not. I think you're correct. There, you know, we all look at it through our own experiences and our own lens. And then when we go to vote, you know, some of us will say, well, I'm voting for simply because she's a woman and not think it through. Mm-hmm. But I think it's more to what you're saying is it's not just because she's a woman, but it's because we do have shared experiences or the possibility of shared experiences and understanding. And I think that is a very part of that, again, the unconscious bias that works for women to support women. But in general, you know, the toughest audience for women is other women. We're not just going to support women just to support women. I mean, it's a hard group. We find, you know, year after year that, you know, the women's supporters, you have to earn their vote. So I don't want women to step up to office just think, oh, the women will be there for me, because they might not be. You're going to need to earn that vote, just like you're going to need to earn the men's vote. And so sometimes we take party votes for granted. Oh, the party will be there for me. I don't think we can automatically do the same thing with the gender. So I think that your point is very well taken, that we need to talk about this more so that people understand why they are supporting women because of this issue or because of the shared experiences on this and so on and so forth. And the more that we talk about it, I think the more people will start to consciously think about it and think, oh, it's not a different gender, it's a shared experience, even though it's a different gender. It also makes women more acceptable in that regards too.
Right, and not believing that. I mean, I've been asked about this recently. So not every woman is going to be energized by the president's Supreme Court justice because it's going to be a woman nominee, right? Because there are clear differences in ideology, in perspective, and priorities, and being very obviously aware to that. And I think, to Nina, to your point, this is also one of the sort of challenges that men are actually afforded, that diversity of opinion, of perspective, right? Like, we assume men are different, but we make claims about women as if they all believe the same thing and they all act in the same way, right? So while again, it's that connect, like, yes, are there some shared experiences along gender lines? I would argue there are some shared, right? They're still diverse, but also there's obviously clear diversity among women that we need to speak to. I wanted to speak to another identity. So Mayor Spicer, you come to public service from a background as an educator. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about how that spurred you to get involved in government, and how, if at all, your background as an educator has shaped both the path to service and also your actual service in this role.
Oh, boy, great. Another great question. Well, you know, the way I look at it, first and foremost, I am grateful that I have a background in education, because as a former classroom teacher, I use all of those skill sets in this job today, where you have management, and, you know, you're changing things on a dime. You're watching different dynamics and people dynamics, and what, you know, you're listening to what's being said, but you're also listening what's behind what's being said. And so those skill sets that you learn as a teacher, navigating multiple energies and doing it very quickly. You know, I taught high school for most of my career, and I taught middle school and high school. And, you know, and so being able to navigate that is so critically important. And so when you think about also what I taught technical things. I taught technology education, I taught architecture and engineering, drawing. These are the things that, so you have to look at the composition of my classes, mostly male, mostly boys in the beginning, and that dynamic started to change when girls could see that, wait a minute, I could take this class too. Wait a minute, there's you know, literally parents' night. You would have parents that would come to my class. I didn't even have their kid in my class, but they wanted to come to see the woman teacher because they couldn't believe there was a woman teaching this here. So that was a dynamic. So you try to fast forward to the notion of service. You know, you come to teaching because you care about being of service, and how this plays this plays out in you know, city government, municipal government. I am also very grateful for a technical brain in engineering and science and engineering, because every single day, especially in the last 6 months as we've navigated COVID, I have to use my engineering thought process in solving problems and challenges in our city. And, you know, an engineering design process, you got a problem, you come up with multiple solutions, you implement the solution, you know, whatever you implement is going to have a consequence. So you evaluate the consequence and to see, okay, yes, that's going to be an issue, but you know what, we're going to go with this because this makes sense. And if you have to redesign or reevaluate it, you go through that whole iterative process of engineering design. So I use those skill sets. I also tap into my network, because each thing I've done in my life has prepared me for this job. And so along the way, being a classroom teacher and administrator, I also was involved in city governance. I was a town meeting member. I was, I worked on different boards and commissions. So that was also part of my service in the community while still doing my day-to-day work. And I also bring in my experience in being in the museum, a venerable institution, traveling worldwide to introduce STEM programs, so all of that, and having to work with legislators, going to Washington to advocate for funding, all of that ties right back to this job that I do today. And that's what gave me the confidence that I knew, even though I did not come to this seat via politics, everything I did not only prepared me for this seat, but it gave me a multiple lenses to look at this work. So when you're building a brand new city, as I'm doing, having the experience of working in a brand new division of the Museum of Science for the last 12 years was a phenomenal groundwork, where you took an organization that started with a small seed funding to, by the time we're leaving, it's a $50 million operation that Michael Bloomberg is supporting. And all of that, and learning to do more with less, because in municipal government, you have to, and making good decisions. So it all prepared me for this. And, and despite the challenges of starting a brand new city, who gets to do that?
Yeah.
And that's exciting. It's daunting. And it is also challenging. COVID, you throw in COVID and an economic downturn and all of that together. It's the perfect storm. But once again, we navigate it just like anything else. You take it one day at a time and make good decisions that impact the community. So that it's been monumental to do that.
That's awesome. And all of that experience comes to play, right? So I want to give both Ava and Nina your organization. I want you to be able to speak a little bit more about the work that your organizations do to cultivate women candidates and sort of tap into all of these experiences. As Mayor Spicer was saying, like, look, I came with all this experience. It might not be seen as the traditional political route, or I may not be part of the party, whatever that may be. You hear women sort of worry about that. But how can you give us sort of a quick overview of what you do, why, and what you perceive as most effective or important about the work of the Lincoln series, Ava, work you do independently, as well as Nina, the work of Emerge. So Ava, do you want to start?
Absolutely, thank you. The mayor just gave us a fantastic demonstration of talking about her qualifications and demonstrating that she's qualified without having to say, I'm qualified. Because women face this issue of not only having to be likable, of having to be qualified. So kudos to the mayor for everything she's accomplished over the years. And if I was in her district, I'd be full-on believer that she's going to be able to do everything that she sets her mind out to do. So kudos to you both for the job, your history, your record of success, but also for your explanation, like I said, of just calmly sharing with us who you are. And I think that that's a lot of what women candidates need to be able to do, is to communicate in the fashion that you did. To our organization, the Lincoln series, we have 2 programs, and we're focused on training and education, recruiting, and growing a statewide network. And in addition to recruiting in candidates, we have developed a second part of the program to focus on getting women involved in politics in general, because not all women are ready to run for office. So our first program is a leadership track, where it's very time intensive, and you learn everything about the state, local, state and federal parties, local, state and federal government. And this is really for women who either know they want to run someday or ready to run right now. But as you know, the point of this whole conversation here is there are a lot of people that are still thinking about it and trying to figure it out, how they navigate it. So we opened up a second track, which is the empowerment, to bring more women in on a slower, more timely basis, but more importantly, to introduce them to other possible political roles, campaign staffs, campaign organizations, consulting, party leadership, because sometimes getting your foot in the door is a way to then introduce them to the possibility of running. Sometimes it's just knowing the right people in politics to be asked to run. So we want to encourage more women to get involved at all levels, and then use that as a farm team to start recruiting more women to run for office. Because there's oftentimes, not around election days, maybe an unfortunate passing of somebody, or somebody's moving to another state, that a seat opens up and people are looking for a candidate. And we want to, or, to be able to say, hey, we got 4 great candidates in your district. Take a look at these 4 women. So we want to not only recruit women that know they want to run, but get women, introduce them to the process, make it less of a, what is that? Demystify it so it becomes more of a natural thing, and line them up to be considered for future, also government appointments as well. I mean, getting women in all aspects of government and public service, as well as elected office. So we're really focused on building that statewide network and that farm team so that we can grow more women in office.
And thank you for that work. As you mentioned earlier, there are fewer organizations on the Republican side of the aisle that have been doing that specific work. So, and I should note, the Excellence in Public Service series is still in a couple of other states at this point. And so it's important that that exists, because the on the other side of the aisle, Emerge has been growing, and at a pretty exponential rate, Nina, right? And so that support infrastructure, right, to try to balance that on both sides of the aisle. So Nina, I want to give you the floor to talk a little bit about the work you do.
Yeah, so I found my way to Emerge 2 years ago. And the reason why is when I first ran for office in 2015, again, I had come from a background of entrepreneurship. I was working with my family, opening up restaurants left and right, loved what I was doing. We had the ability to in all the community we went into, and so just getting to know community stakeholders, nonprofits, the PTOs, those kinds of organizations, we were always able to get really involved in them. And I loved that work. And so, and when it came to a head, when I had decided to run for office, very similar to me, I knew the community really well, but fundraise for homeless shelter. I could fundraise for the South Bay to send kids to camp every summer. But the second I had to fundraise for, it was terrible. If somebody handed me $100 check for my campaign, I had no idea what to do with it. And I was lucky enough at the time to be surrounded by a team of just incredible people who are in this, who are consultants, and they do this, for a living. And we're lucky enough in Massachusetts that we have a wealth of incredible consultants as well. And so had it not been for them, I think I would have been, just to be frank, scared out of the process. It's very daunting when you have to talk to 100,000 people. You don't know how, you don't know strategically how you're supposed to do that in the limited time that you have. And so, again, I was very blessed to have this team around me when I first ran. And that's what Emerge does. Had I known about Emerge at the time, I would have taken it, because that's what I needed, and that's what this organization does. We want to reach women across this Commonwealth, whether or down in Fall River, out in Taunton, out in Springfield, Pittsfield, wherever it may be. Those women are out there, they work day in and day out in their communities, and they're the ones making the decisions that impact themselves and their neighbors and their community that they're working in right now. And so Emerge does a 6-month training program where they go soup to nuts, from everything, like I said, to how do you put your campaign plan together, how do you work through your calendar, your scheduling, your fundraising, to doing call time, to doing management with your campaign team, to doing kitchen cabinet, to doing messaging, to field work, to holding signs and doing mailers. I mean, all of the above, because one of the things that should not hold you back are those steps, and I know for me, it certainly was something that could have very easily deterred me from running for office. And, I just think about how many other women out there are qualified to hold these positions, particularly the ones, if you think about building the bench and raising those numbers on the federal level. Look at the county races that are happening this year, look at the Register of Deeds, Register of Probate, Sheriff, DA, Governor's Council, to appoint judges. I mean, that seat alone, especially right now, how important is that, right? On the local level, that directly impacts us. And one is to make sure that we're training women who are running across this Commonwealth, but also more importantly, at all levels of government, because unless we are able to populate those seats with more women, and even to your earlier point, women that we can relate to, unless we continue to train those women in these different communities, I don't want that to hold people back from running. And so we have the 6-month program where we do that from January through June. We also have a boot camp program where you take all of that and you condense it into, 2.5 days, which is what the mayor did, because again, she does a gazillion things and God only knows how, but we have that program. But then, what I had talked about earlier with having that team, right? You can't do it alone. None of us can do this work alone. We can't run for office alone, and we certainly can't legislate alone. So we also now have a 2.5-day intensive campaign manager training program for women who want to get involved and run elections. And I was saying earlier about having more women sort of be in that fundraising ether at the high level. You need to also think about that as far as the consultants go. How many women out there are running campaigns, at high levels or at any level, and how many women out there are fundraisers? How many women out there, can run fields? And we need to grow that pool as well. And so we're training at all those different levels, and we want women everywhere at all corners of the state. If you're interested in getting involved, please come and take the program. The network is growing, and this is the only way that we can continue to support each other, I feel, to continue to get the word out.
So thank you to both of you, again, for the work you're doing. I think building those networks, providing those tools are so important. So I want to get to some of these audience Q&A before our time is up. So I'm just going to read through a few here. One specific to Mayor Spicer. Congratulations on becoming the first mayor of Framingham. Many of us in Brookline hope to see the same transition to city governance. So this is from Kate. Do you think Framingham's transition to city made your candidacy more possible than it might have been in an existing city? Did being a woman, did being a person of color help the town to lean into identity change, improve trust? Anything else? Could you speak to the transition away from town in your personal leadership? A lot of questions there, but I think general thought there.
I'll do my best to try to answer, Kate. Well, first and foremost, when Framingham stopped being the largest town in Massachusetts, I think Brookline now holds that honor of being the largest town in Massachusetts. So, and once again, our transition from a town to a city, it took 317 years. And this was probably, I think, the third, either the third or fourth try at becoming a city. And it only won by a very small margin. So what you ended up with is approximately half of this community wanting to stay a town and half wanting to be a city. And so that's the kind of format that we had. And so running to become a city, what did that mean for Framingham? There were many people, I'd ask the question, what do you want in our city government? Why did you vote to become a city? Now, I don't know, I just want to change. I wanted something different. I want to change. And truly, that is what my campaign represented, was change. And my tagline is Yvonne Spicer, the people's mayor. And that felt good I am the people's mayor. I am connected to people, our seniors, our young people. It was important that I think the thing that made the difference for me is that I was not entrenched in the political network that had been an integral part of the city. And so I see opportunity. I see us becoming a city. We're a baby city. We're still, we're a toddler. We haven't even stood up well yet. We're still, I think we're on crawl stage here, but and it's also having to understand and appreciate the fact that a good number of the people in this community really miss being a town and don't lose sight of their involvement, having town meeting. And town meeting wasn't just to take care of the city's business or the town's business, it was a social occasion. We've lost that connection. So trying to find those avenues to keep bringing people together. And even now during COVID, I do a weekly Zoom meeting, community hour. Sometimes it's a topic, sometimes just talk to me. Dial in and let's chat. Tell me about what's happening. I try very hard to stay very connected to people. And so it does lend itself for a lot of growth and opportunity. And that's why I come back to bringing in some of my prior experience of working in a nonprofit like the Museum of Science, innovative ideas to move a city forward. But having to lay that foundation first and continue to move that. So it's riddled with opportunity that I am. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that's anything that is innovative and new, and I accept that. But I also know that there's plenty of potential here 20 miles west of Boston in this wonderful community of 8,000 strong, that great opportunities for businesses, for opportunities for learning. It's just a great place to be. I've been here for 35 years. So, know that we're still in process, and I'm still in this fight, and I'm going to continue to fight for this city. According to our charter, I can do it for 12 consecutive years. So I got a few more I can still be mayor. And so we'll see how that all plays itself out. But, it is something that is pretty exciting, and I am enjoying the journey for the most part.
And now we're all going to join you for your Zoom community meetings to check in. So there's two questions that I'm going to ask in combination. They're not exactly the same, but I think, Ava, they do speak specifically to some comments you had made earlier. So Susan asks, do the panelists feel that in some situations, women are a political asset for a political party? For instance, in some of the races that Kelly mentioned at the beginning, a number feature Republican women running against incumbent Democrats. Is that a deliberate strategy? I also think of President Trump's promise to nominate a woman for Justice Ginsburg's seat. And this is the sort of somewhat related question, so if you want to speak to either or both. Dawn asks, can Ava speak more to the idea that Republican voters don't yet view women as best for the job, and how can Republican women press against that idea? So in some ways they do seem a little related, right? So are you running women for a reason? And then is there any challenge if folks aren't seeing women as qualified?
Yes, I see how those are related, so thank you. You cannot assume that as a woman, you're going to get support of women. You have to use that as an asset, which relates to the second question, is that yes, being a woman is an asset these days in itself. In general, women are still viewed as not being a part of the problem. So because we don't hold the majority of seats, or because we don't hold all levels of office as much as the men do, we are not considered to be a part of the problem as men are considered to be. So it starts as an asset in that regards. You just can't assume that everybody's going to buy into that. So what I'm saying is and there's always exceptions to the rules if you're a female candidate, that maybe people will vote for you because you're a woman. You just can't assume that it's there. So in politics in general, though, you can't assume anybody's with you. So you have to work for every single vote. And that's really the point here, is that use the fact that you're a woman as an asset. Use the fact of your experiences maybe being different to some people. Use that as a strength, being the same to other people. So even if it might be, some people might consider it a negative, what we do in campaigns is we turn those negatives into strengths. Try and figure out how that difference becomes a commonality. What is there that maybe you don't see? A simple example is, you're not going to see eye to eye with every voter on every issue. So rather than focusing on the difference, focus on what issues you do see eye to eye on. So similarly with genders, what commonality comes together out of that? So there may be lots of circumstances, and there are lots of circumstances where women are seen as an asset just for being a woman, like I said, because you're not part of the problem, but also because you do bring different experiences to the table. So we need to highlight those, we need to talk about those, and just don't assume voters will be with us because we're women, but rather use that as our strength, promote it as our strength, and make it part of our story. And don't just wave the banner, vote for me because I'm a woman, but because I'm a woman, I've had this experience, and I can bring these results to you. So the key there being, it's sometimes, I like to teach people that sometimes, this really is not about you, the candidate, but what about you, the candidate, are going to bring to me, the voter, as a result for my community. So you need to make that second part of the statement. Don't just do the first part of the statement. Complete the sentence, complete the thought. Let us know why. You have to make that connection. You have to explain why being a woman is an asset, and not assume people know why.
Do you think that, I think part of the question too, like, is it deliberate? We've been asked this a lot, that Republican women are running against Democratic women. Do you think there's any, I would say from our experience, there's not a clear recruitment strategy across the board here, but
yeah.
You think, yeah, okay.
No, there's not a clear strategy of, the party got into a room and said, wherever there's a Democrat woman, let's run a Republican woman. But in certain states and districts, are people thinking that? Absolutely, because that levels the playing field and takes that issue off the table. Then it becomes about, where do the candidates stand on the issues? What kind of experience do they bring to the table? And they take that strength from the incumbent off the table by making both women available. But is it a big national strategy? No. Is it a more localized, because politics is all local? Yes.
Mm-hmm. This is the last question we had, so I do want to make sure I read it, then we've caught everything. So this is from Lolita. In terms of diversity of opinion among women, I agree men are afforded more opportunity to different ideology, generally speaking, but looking at issues of race, it seems that white women are the most likely to have wider diversities of ideologies among women candidates than women of color, especially Black women. Whether the relative narrowness of Black, Indigenous, people of color, women's political ideologies is a good thing or a bad thing depends on who you ask, I suppose. But given that these women of color tend to be more progressive on women's rights issues, I wonder if having a diversity of ideologies among women serves us from a rights perspective. So not necessarily sort of a comment, but is there something there to speak to also making sure we're clear about valuing the diversity, I think, of opinion among women, I think is part of that question.
You know what I want to, I just want to tap into this because, you know, I think it comes with age and gender, you know, not only race, but also age. And, you know, and I'm a tail end baby boomer. But I also love the thinking of my Gen X and Y and Z folks, because I also see how and particularly those that are of color, they are at a very different place than I am in terms of how I navigate. In other words, I think they have less patience with dealing with issues around racism, discrimination, and seeing the dynamics as something that, you know, no, we're not waiting. We want it changed now. Right now. And so that's also inspiring me in so many ways, because I feel like, you know, as I at some point pass the baton, there is a greater urgency to deal with some of these issues that separate us rather than include everyone. And I'm, you know, certainly from this seat that I'm in right now, I'm going to do my part, but I know this work is deep. It's very deep, it's entrenched, it's the fabric of this country is built on some very inequitable situations. And it takes everybody wanting to work on this. So there comes that progressive mindset or versus, you know, the civil rights activism. You know, we've seen a lot of the activism, you know, because I said, okay, we've had protests, okay, let's come with the plan. You know, come on, let's get that plan together. Because at the end of the day, and it's going to take a lot of effort and ongoing effort. Sometimes you know, for me, being a baby boomer, I look at when you know, when I was born, my parents couldn't vote in this country. They could not vote when I was born. So, and then I look at where we are right now, and it's sort of like 1965 here, you know, 50 plus years later, where are we? You know, so it's a daunting thing, and you know, and you can get very discouraged by it, but you can also be inspired. And I think I choose to be very inspired by this time, especially by our progressive young people, our generational people, the X, Y, and Z. They're going to be the needle movers. We're going to see some movement, and I'm right here. You know, we've been in the fight for all years, but I said, you know, there's time when you feel like you need to pass the baton. You keep running. You're in the relay. I'm still here in the race, but I'm gonna pass the baton and have you keep running with it too.
So I would argue that you're also a needle pointer, or, you know what I mean? Like you're absolutely, I think, you know, paving the way for a lot of people and in the work that you're doing. And I just want to say quickly a little bit about that question with, you know, sort of a range of where you are, you know, as a candidate or as a woman of color. And I think, you know, one example for this, for me, that comes very front of mind is, you know, my colleague, I only serve with one other woman on the city council, by the way, to anyone out there who lives in Quincy, just putting that there for you all. And her and I, you know, certainly do share the same values and same perspectives and same ideologies when it comes to women's rights. You know, we share a lot of the same issues, you know, that we fight for every single day. However, as a white woman, she does not have front of mind the translation services that are needed in this city. And that is one of my top priorities with everything I do, whether it's the schools, the MBTA meetings, the city's meetings, our meetings. whatever that may be, that is a huge topic for me, because I know what it's like to have to translate things for my family and for my parents still to this day. And so I don't know necessarily that, white women versus women of color are afforded different ideologies and what that means for them as candidates. I just think that, again, it really, your experience and who you are really shines in what it is that you're running on and what your platform is, and if those issues are important to you, then you're going to run on them, whether it's one issue, just translation services, or it's an array of issues based off of your experience. Even to your point, as women, things we can relate to one another because of our experiences as women, or, to the mayor's point, as women of color, things that we can relate to because of our experiences as women of color. And so I think, whether or not we have the flexibility to have a varied, sort of set of ideologies that we can campaign on or talk about, I really think it does, again, come down to the individual and why they're running for office, what drove them to run for office, what was that final thing for them that said enough is enough, and I need to step up and I need to make that difference.
So I not only appreciate that I got the chance to spend a Friday afternoon with you all, but this Friday afternoon especially. This was a positive moment. You guys have been so sort of optimistic. Mayor Spicer and Nina, those last comments, I think, speak to forward looking. This is a painful time for a lot of us, right? And it's a difficult time, and it's a difficult time to look at politics and be hopeful. But I think that you all have given us that collectively, and given us, and hopefully some of those watching, some inspiration, and those of us who are researchers, some ideas about how we can do our work better as well to support the practice and ensure that we do see an advancement of women in political power. So we're just a little over time, so we were also successful in that regard because women are effective at their jobs. And so I just want to thank you all again, and I hope that we can have this conversation. Again, we're going to Zoom Mayor Spicer's town hall so that we can continue these conversations. And thank you to all the audience members for your questions and for tuning in to our conversation today.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you so much, everyone.
The next session is 1:45. The Zoom link is in the panel, or in the chat. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
You too.